Vaping on our Seattle rooftop at midnight, I, Lily, 22, dared my stepdad, Jack, 45, a former botanist, to name the plants in the skyline's glow. I leaned in, his arm grazed my shoulder, city lights blurred. Mom's away, 2 weeks sparked fast, too fast. A coffee shop clash flipped us, what broke it? You'll reel. The night was crisp in Seattle, the kind that bites your skin, and I, Lily, 22, stood on the rooftop of our downtown loft, puffing a vape, the cherry glow cutting the dark. It was past midnight, the city buzzing below, and Mom was off on a business trip, her last text a smug bet I'd keep the place calm, way off. My stepdad, Jack, a 45-year-old ex-botanist who'd swapped greenhouses for a desk job, always had this quiet vibe, eyes sharp like he saw more than he said, and it pulled me in ways I didn't pin down. I'd caught him watching me at breakfast, and tonight, I was wired. The rooftop door creaked, and Jack stepped out, hauling a beat-up field guide, its pages curling. He set it on the ledge, his denim jacket open over a faded tee, dark hair streaked with silver catching the neon. He didn't look at me, just flipped the book, muttering about urban flora, bet I'd never noticed the rooftop ferns. I smirked, exhaled a cloud, flirty, saying he'd name every leaf like a pro, bet he'd show me something rare. He glanced up, his hand brushing the guide, smirking, saying rare wasn't my speed, bet I'd missed the first weed. I flicked my vape, stepped closer, my hoodie and jeans shifting as I leaned near the ledge, teasing that missing was my edge, bet he'd point it out. He smirked, turned a page, his elbow grazing my arm, muttering pointing was my dodge, bet I'd lose the skyline. I nudged his shoulder, flirty, saying losing was my jam, bet he'd guide me anyway. He tapped a fern, voice low, and I leaned in, my hair brushing his sleeve, pretending to squint, teasing he looked sharp explaining, bet he'd mapped wilder plots. His hand slid to my shoulder, light but firm, nudging me to see the fern's fronds, saying I'd spot it better, bet I'd fall for it. My pulse jumped, heat spiking, and I bumped his hip, flirty, saying falling was my kick, bet he'd catch me green-eyed. He smirked, fingers lingering, warm through my hoodie, muttering catching was my trap, bet I'd reel him out. I grinned, pressed closer, my knee brushing his, teasing that reeling was my thrill, bet he'd tug it tight. He shifted, his arm grazing mine, saying tugging was my game, bet I'd spin him off course. The city hummed below, lights sharp, and I tilted my head, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying he was too steady, bet he'd bloom if I pushed. He smirked, flipped the guide, his hand grazing my arm again, teasing, muttering blooming was my mess, bet I'd wilt this night. I nudged his elbow, flirty, saying wilting was my spark, bet he'd tend it anyway. He leaned in, his knee nudging mine, muttering tending was my hustle, bet I'd overrun him. I smirked, my hand grazing his on the guide, teasing that overrunning was my win, bet he'd grow with me. The rooftop buzzed, air sharp, and I stepped back, twirling my vape, saying he looked damn good lit up, bet he'd teach me more. He smirked, tucked the guide, his fingers brushing my wrist, teasing, saying teaching was my fantasy, bet I'd stray off path. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying straying was my play, bet he'd steer me back. He stood, his arm grazing my shoulder, muttering steering was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, nudged his elbow, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd bite it hard. The night deepened, Seattle glowing, and I lingered, knowing I'd sparked something, lights up, tension hotter. Mom was gone, and I headed in, leaving him with the guide, his eyes still on me, and I knew I'd hooked him, sky clear, stakes high. 2 days after the rooftop spark, I was still buzzing from that neon night, Jack's hand on my shoulder, his low voice naming ferns, stuck like a beat. Mom was still off, her last call a curt bet I'd keep the loft tidy, not even close. I wandered into the kitchen that morning, barefoot in a cropped tee and joggers, the air thick with espresso and rain. Jack leaned on the counter, flipping a plant journal, his flannel open over a gray tea, glasses low. He didn't look up, just muttered I'd better not swipe his brew, bet I'd choke on it. I grinned, hopped onto a stool, my knee brushing the counter, flirty, saying he looked hot with his plants, bet he'd name me one too. He smirked, slid the journal aside, saying plants didn't flirt, bet I'd misread the whole plot. I leaned forward, my elbow nudging the counter near his arm, teasing that flirting was my route, bet he'd grow it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a mug by my wrist, fingers lingering, saying growing was my dodge, bet I'd uproot him. I tapped the journal, flirty, saying uprooting was my light, bet he'd track it sharp. He smirked, slid the mug my way, his knuckles grazing mine, muttering lighting was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this roast. I sipped, the espresso sharp, teasing, saying owing was my hook, bet he'd brew it with that grin. He leaned closer, his shoulder shifting, teasing back, saying brewing was my hustle, bet I'd scald him dry. I grinned, bumped my knee against the stool, flirty, saying scalding was my kick, bet he'd sip it anyway. He smirked, grabbed his mug, his arm brushing the journal, muttering sipping was my trap, bet I'd reel him out. I nudged his elbow, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd tug it tight. The kitchen hummed, rain streaking the windows, and I flipped the journal open, pointing at a fern sketch, my shoulder grazing his, saying he looked damn good decoding, bet he'd mapped wilder plots. He smirked, turned a page, his elbow nudging mine, teasing that plots didn't sass, bet I'd blur this one. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying blurring was my vibe, bet he'd focus it anyway. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm, tracing a leaf, muttering focusing was my dream, bet I'd drift off fast. I leaned in, my knee pressing the counter, flirty, saying drifting was my thrill, bet he'd steer me back. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he set the journal down, saying I'd better watch it, I bet I'd tangle this morning. I smirked, grabbed a spoon, stirred my espresso slow, teasing that tangling was my spark, bet he'd flip it too. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, muttering flipping was my chaos, bet I'd spill it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my win, bet he'd mop it anyway. He smirked, leaned back, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering mopping was my trap, bet I'd soak him quick. The coffee steamed, the room bright, and I stayed, sipping, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine, teasing, saying flaring was my mess, bet I'd tip this counter. I grinned, nudged his chest, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He leaned closer, his knee nudging mine, muttering holding was my play, bet I'd slip anyway. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my game, bet he'd catch me sharp. The morning pulsed, tension simmering, and I stood, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my star. He smirked, turned the page, his hand brushing mine, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He didn't pull away, tension humming, and I knew I'd hooked him espresso cold, stakes high. For days after the kitchen flirt, the Seattle afternoon was gray, the loft's tiny balcony a concrete slab with a potted fern and a wobbly chair where I sat, scrolling my phone, the air damp with mist. Mom was still off, her last text a brisk bet I'd kept the place neat, no shot. I'd been replaying Jack's smirks, his quick brushes, and they'd rooted deeper than I meant. He stepped out, tweaking the fern's soil, his flannel rolled up, jeans worn, glasses glinting. He muttered I'd better not mess his plant, bet I'd kill it blind. I grinned, swiped my screen, flirty, saying he looked sharp with that fern, bet he'd spot me in a forest. He smirked, poked the soil, saying forests didn't flirt, bet I'd blur the whole green. I leaned back, my sneaker brushing the chair near his, teasing that flirting was my vine, bet he'd track it anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing the pot by my phone, fingers hovering, saying tracking was my sidestep, bet I'd throw him off trail. I swiped again, flirty, saying throwing was my flair, bet he'd map it tight. He smirked, shifted the pot, his arm grazing the chair, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd owe him for this leaf. I stood, snapping a fern pick, my hip brushing the chair near him, teasing that owing was my angle, bet he'd tend it with that grin. He took my phone, his fingers brushing mine, teasing back, saying tending was my bait, bet I'd lure him out. I grinned, leaned closer, my knee nudging his chair, flirty, saying luring was my glow, bet he'd chase it anyway. He smirked, set the phone down, his elbow brushing my arm, muttering chasing was my snare, bet I'd hook him too far. I tapped the pot, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd reel it sharp. The mist fell, fern dripping, and I circled the chair, my shoulder brushing his back, saying he looked damn good pruning, bet he'd charted wilder plots than this. He smirked, turned the pot, his hand brushing my wrist, teasing that plots didn't sass, bet I'd cloud this one. I grinned, leaned in, my elbow pressing his side, flirty, saying clouding was my vibe, bet he'd clear it anyway. He shifted, his fingers grazing my arm, tweaking the fern, muttering clearing was my dream, bet I'd drift off quick. I smirked, pressed my knee against his chair, flirty, saying drifting was my thrill, bet he'd anchor me. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he checked the soil, saying I'd better watch it, bet I'd tangle this balcony. I smirked, grabbed my phone, snapping another pic, teasing that tangling was my light, bet he'd spin it too. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, muttering spinning was my mess, bet I'd blur it first. I leaned in, flirty, saying blurring was my win, bet he'd sharpen it. He smirked, set the phone down, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering sharpening was my trap, bet I'd snag him clean. The drizzle pulsed, dusk creeping, and I stayed close, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my arm, teasing, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd tip this chair. I grinned, tapped the fern, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, leaned in, his knee brushing mine, muttering holding was my hustle, bet I'd slip anyway. I grinned, nudged his elbow, teasing, saying slipping was my play, bet he'd catch me tight. The balcony quieted, stars fading in, and I stepped back, grabbing my vape, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my flare. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine, teasing, saying chasing was my game, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, snapped one last pic, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He stood, fern set, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, lights out, stakes soaring. 3 days after the balcony tease, the Seattle night was sharp, the loft's living room lit by a laptop's glow, casting shadows on the rug. Mom was still off, her last voicemail a tired bet I'd kept the chaos low, dead wrong. I'd been savoring Jack's quiet smirks, his subtle nudges, and they'd settled deep. I sprawled on the couch, legs up, sipping a stolen IPA, my tea and joggers slipping. Jack came in from the kitchen, a beer in hand, his flannel open over a tea, glasses fogged from steam. He set it down, his fingers brushing the table near my can, muttering I'd better not chug it, I bet I'd crash first. I grinned, swirled my beer, flirty, saying he looked smooth pouring, bet he'd uncork a wild night. He smirked, sank into the armchair, his knee grazing the table, saying nights didn't flirt, bet I'd talk it flat. I leaned forward, my elbow nudging the table by his arm, teasing that talking was my spark, bet he'd sip it green. He sipped, his hand brushing the bottle near my wrist, teasing, saying sipping was my orbit, bet I'd reel him off course. I swung my legs down, my foot brushing his chair, flirty, saying reeling was my glow, bet he'd chase it anyway. He smirked, leaned in, his arm stretching, muttering chasing was my snare, bet I'd hook him out. The beer cooled my throat, and I slid closer, my shoulder near his sleeve, saying he looked damn fine chilling, bet he'd mapped louder nights. He smirked, grabbed another beer, his fingers grazing my hand, teasing that nights didn't sass, bet I'd cloud this one. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying clouding was my pulse, bet he'd clear it sharp. He muted the laptop, his arm brushing mine, muttering clearing was my lure, bet I'd drift off fast. I grinned, pressed my elbow into his side, flirty, teasing that drifting was my rush, bet he'd anchor me tight. He leaned back, eyes locking mine, saying I'd better slow it, bet I'd spin this room wild. I smirked, bumped his shoulder, flirty, sipping slow, teasing that spinning was my flair, bet he'd roll with it. He smirked, he shifted, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering rolling was my bait, bet I'd drag him too far. I leaned in, my knee pressing his chair, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd tag along. He smirked, fingers tapping mine, teasing, muttering tagging was my win, bet I'd snag him clean. The laptop hummed, an ad droning, and I stretched, my arm brushing his chest, saying he looked too calm, bet he'd spark if I pushed. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering sparking was my tangle, bet I'd tip this couch. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying tipping was my vibe, bet he'd hold it steady. He shifted, his hand grazing my elbow, growling holding was my dream, bet I'd slip quick. I smirked, nudged his chest, flirty, saying slipping was my rush, bet he'd catch me anyway. The night pulsed, beer softening edges, and I stayed close, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my light. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine, teasing, saying chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He leaned in, his arm brushing my back, muttering biting was my trap, bet I'd twist him out. I laughed, bumped his knee, teasing, saying twisting was my play, bet he'd swing it anyway. The room hummed, tension thick, and I leaned back, knowing I'd hooked him beer low, stakes high. The day before Mom was due back, her flu fading, I'd been riding 2 weeks of flirty vibes with Jack in our Seattle loft. Her last text bet I'd kept things chill, not a chance. That afternoon, I'd dragged him to a local coffee shop, craving its buzz over our quiet nights. I wore a tight sweater and jeans, and he drove us, his usual flannel swapped for a sharp jacket, hair neat, looking slicker than I'd guessed. He parked in the dim lot, muttering I'd better not start drama, bet I'd pull him in. I grinned, a flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked too cool for this spot, bet he'd light it up with me. The shop hummed, lights warm, chatter loud, steam hissing, and I wove through, tugging his sleeve, teasing he'd better move, bet he'd vibe with me. He smirked, stayed close, his hand brushing my shoulder, saying vibing was my orbit, bet I'd spin him out. I leaned into the counter, my hip grazing his, flirty, ordering lattes, saying he'd need one, bet he'd loosen up. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing that loosening was my snare, bet I'd reel him flat. I grinned, bumped his elbow, saying reeling was my flair, bet he'd chase it down. The chatter swelled, and I pulled him to a corner table, the crowd buzzing, my fingers tapping as I faced him, teasing he looked stiff, bet he'd flow with me. He smirked, leaned in, his hands near my cup, light, guiding, muttering flowing was my chaos, bet I'd trip him up. I laughed, shifted closer, my shoulder brushing his arm, flirty, saying tripping was my spark, bet he'd catch it quick. His grip hovered, warm, his knee nudging mine, teasing that catching was my trap, bet I'd twist him raw. I grinned, my hand grazing his sleeve, saying twisting was my rush, bet he'd hold on anyway. The lights glowed, steam curling, and I leaned, my back brushing his arm, teasing he was too steady, bet he'd flare for this. He smirked, his hand sliding to my cup, light, muttering flaring was my mess, bet I'd burn this place. I spun back, my elbow pressing his side, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it slow. His fingers tapped my cup, voice low, saying fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, teasing that blazing was my win, bet he'd stick for it. The noise softened, the crowd thinning, and I stayed close, breathless, saying he looked damn hot here, bet he'd take me home wild. He smirked, his hand lingering, muttering wild was my chaos, bet I'd drag him too far. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying dragging was my vibe, bet he'd chase it anyway. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, muttering chasing was my play, bet I'd twist him up. I laughed, spun away, heading for the counter, calling he'd miss my heat, bet he'd catch up. He trailed me, the shop humming, and I grabbed another latte, leaning on the counter, my elbow brushing his arm, teasing he was too calm, bet he'd spark for me. He smirked, took one too, his hand brushing mine, muttering sparking was my trap, bet I'd snag him tight. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying snagging was my rush, bet he'd drink it down. The night roared, tension thick, and I felt it surge, his pull was electric, and I wanted more, my pulse racing with the buzz. I leaned, saying he was too good, bet he'd light my sky. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine, teasing that lighting was my game, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd hooked him, shop loud, stakes louder. After the coffee shop, Mom's return loomed, her trip cut short, her last text betting I'd stayed chill, blind to my 2-week spark with Jack. We'd walked home past 2 a.m., buzzed from caffeine, the car idling as I teased he'd owned the shop, bet he'd claim me next. He'd smirked, parked smooth, and we'd slipped inside, my head spinning. In my sweater and jeans, I leaned in the hall, flirty, saying he'd ruled, bet he'd take me now. He smirked, shut the door, jacket off, muttering taking was my hustle, bet I'd wreck it. I grinned, stepped closer, hip brushing his, teasing wrecking was my flair, bet he'd grab it. He caught my wrist, light, pulling me to the living room, growling I'd gone too far, bet I'd sink us. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in. He nudged me to the couch, hand grazing my arm. I sank down, sweater shifting, teasing he looked wild, bet he'd catch me here. He sat close, knee nudging mine, hands near my hips, muttering catching was my mess, bet I'd twist him out. A phone buzzed, Mom's text, home early, asking where I was. I froze, bolted up, heart slamming, muttering she's back, bet we're done. Jack cursed, saying timing was hell. Mom burst in, eyes wide, demanding why I was so wired. I stammered it was just coffee. She grabbed my phone, saw my fern pics, and flipped, yelling at Jack for letting me run wild. She turned to me, saying, "We're done here. Pack, we're out." She hauled me to my room, tossed my bag, shouting, "We're leaving, now," and dragged me to the car, peeling out, leaving him in the dark. I slumped, buzz gone, knowing I'd lit it. I bet it burned us.